Maybe the greatest deception in history will not come through open invasion from the sky, although I think something like that will happen, but through imitation and integration, right? Through promises of evolving spiritually and physically, enlightenment, unity, and transcendence. All of that is coming your way, folks. You've already been bombarded in every movie in Hollywood with this garbage. So you'll be given a counterfeit Eden and a counterfeit kingdom and a counterfeit inheritance. And I think it's probably been the plan from the very beginning to fill the earth with their seed, their systems, their kingdoms, and their cities until the wheat itself disappears from the field like it did before the flood. And Scripture says the harvest is coming. Hello, gang. You know, it's interesting to me that every time the UFO subject comes up, the entire conversation immediately gravitates toward craft, lights in the sky, propulsion systems, government cover-ups, reverse engineering, crash saucers, and whether or not disclosure is finally coming. In fact, we kind of ourselves handled that in our past episode this last Monday. But I think there's a far more unsettling question that very few people are asking, but I thought of immediately after last Monday's episode. Not what is flying these craft, but where are the occupants when we don't see them? Where do they go? Because if you step back and look at decades of UFO lore, well, paranormal encounters, abduction testimony, ancient mythology, and even biblical themes surrounding the seed war that we cover here, you begin to notice a strange recurring pattern, right? Entities that appear almost human, which is super duper creepy. Let me expand this a little bit here because that's, yeah, there we go. Entities attempting to imitate human behavior. Entities that seem to require some form of permission. Entities that mimic human behavior but don't fully understand it according to many testimonials. Like they don't get it. Like they're acting as if they have a 90s or 1800s mindset in modern culture. They don't understand even how to operate a pen properly. So over time, according to the lore itself, they appear to be getting better at it. So now tonight, I'm not telling you that every story online is true, of course. I mean, we research things and so we check things out. And I'm not saying every creepy encounter automatically means that demons or hybrids or Nephilim or whatever. But what I am saying is that there are recurring motifs that continue appearing over and over and over again across generations, across cultures and modern encounters in ways that aren't easily explained by just saying, well, they're copying this. Well, when you get reports from locations that are similar to other areas where they have no means of communicating things like this, that starts to get hard to explain, right? When multiple encounters, multiple stories, multiple testimonies begin agreeing with each other when there's no way they could have copied one another, so to speak. I know there's plenty of that goes on today, but I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about encounters and the number of them where you have this phenomenon going on where there's no way they could have known. And yet the descriptions are eerily similar. And so the most chilling part of this, I think, is what if disclosure isn't really about visitors arriving? I think something like that will happen. But what about entities that may have already integrated themselves among humanity right now? Like they're here living among us, call them NPCs, call them whatever you want to call them. They're more human than ever and harder to recognize that these are not people who are fully human, either through their behavior or whatever. So before we go too deep into this, I want to play a short clip involving one of the more famous black-eyed kid encounters ever recorded. If you're not familiar with it, it's the Brian Bethel case from 1996. Just a short clip, but I want to just whet your appetite for what we're dealing with here, and it's going to get more in-depth. So let's listen to this. Wait, let me make sure that I've got this set up appropriately, or we will not get it. It will come through my studio monitors and blast my face off because I was recording earlier. Yes, I'm working on another album, all instrumental. I haven't decided on the name of the album. I'm thinking of the music of Arda, which is Middle Earth. Anyway, it's all instrumental stuff based off of music I feel in my heart when I think of Middle Earth, and play loud metal music because I like rock, I like metal. And I may decide to tag one of my things onto the end of this, perhaps? Or maybe I'll tell you what, when I edit the show for tonight, I will put the intro music as, and I might have done this already, but I'll do it again because still working on it. But it's the song I wrote, performed, dealing with the massive spider that hung out with Morgoth, if you recall, whose name, for whatever reason, I cannot recall at the moment. Anyway, I'll remember it later and I'll probably mention it. But the gigantic spider, and for whatever reason, I'm having a brain fart at the moment, but I'll put that at the beginning intro music and let it play through. And you can just kind of hear it in the background softly as I play through. But because it's not been uploaded yet, so I shouldn't get any copyright things that I have to explain to YouTube, is my own music, which is so annoying. It's automated. So all of this automated garbage just is very frustrating. Anyway, let's get to this clip.
1996, a man named Brian Bethel, a journalist from Abilene, Texas, pulled into a parking lot late at night to write a check and drop it off at a bill drop box. As he sat in his car with the interior light on, two young boys approached his window. They were around 9 to 12 years old, dressed in hoodies. Something about them was off. They didn't make eye contact. Their voices were calm but emotionless. The older one said, "Hey, mister, we left our money at home. Can you give us a ride to our house? We want to see the movie, but we need to get our money first." Brian felt a rising sense of dread, even though the boys were polite. Then he looked into their faces and realized their eyes were completely black. No whites, no irises, just solid liquid black. He couldn't explain it, but his body screamed to run. The boys seemed to sense this and became more aggressive. "We can't get in unless you say it's okay, just let us in. It's not like we have a weapon or anything." Brian tore out of the parking lot in pure panic. When he looked in the rearview mirror, the boys were gone. 1996.
All right, so that's pretty creepy, right? And it's really interesting that they ask for permission. Don't you think that's interesting? And they don't seem to have social cues. It's almost like they were doing test runs on newer models just to see how we would respond to them. So, and like I said earlier, whether you believe every detail of the black-eyed kid phenomenon, there's multiple examples of this back then, mostly in the 80s and 90s, some earlier, like this one. But there are certain patterns that show up repeatedly in these stories that are really fascinating, like the emotional reaction. Almost everybody describes an overwhelming dread that is external to them. Not ordinary fear, but something primal, and you're like a fight or flight type thing, something instinctive, like a feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with what they're looking at and strange. And then the behavior, the entities in these stories often appear almost completely human. Just things are just slightly off. Their pale skin, their speech can sound like rehearsed, like somebody reading a really bad acting script, or artificial, like something trying to imitate normal interaction without really fully understanding it, or how the body they are in operates. They're still figuring it out. And then third, and maybe the strangest detail of all, the permission thing. They all seem to need your permission. Let us in. Let us do this. Sort of like the whole vampire thing, right? And that theme appears constantly. And that's fascinating because permission-based entry is deeply embedded in ancient folklore traditions. Like I said, vampires, fae encounters, spirit visitation, threshold symbolism, like we talked about with Vicky Joy Anderson, covenant language, and again, ancient cultures preserved stories of entities that could not simply force their way in, but they required your permission, your invitation, because I believe it gives them legal right to do so. Now, maybe all of this is psychological, but I don't think so. And maybe some of it is, I'm sure there's plenty of them that are just mere internet folklore amplified over time. It's just the consistency of the motif is what makes it so interesting, because the lore begins to shift from simple monsters to entities attempting mimicry, attempting integration, attempting humanity itself to copy us. And that leads directly into this next clip that I want to show you. And this deals with Men in Black, that phenomenon, and probably not in the way that you're thinking. This is a little bit different than what I was expecting when I saw this clip. And it's about 4 minutes long, but it's worth watching. And it just seems like this phenomenon and the idea that some encounters throughout UFO history involve entities that seem to understand humanity intellectually, but not in a natural way. You see what I'm saying? I'm not quite sure how to communicate what I'm saying here, but it's like they know us in a mathematic way, but they don't know how to be truly human, almost like AI. AI just does what it does and it doesn't understand the human aspect. Even if you tell it, sound more human, they still don't quite know how to do it or retain memory. Or anyway, just pay attention to the repeated theme here: telepathy, strange behavior, odd social interaction, and witnesses claiming these beings seemed almost human, but not completely. So let's go ahead and take a listen to this one.
Bridgeport, Connecticut. 1953. Albert K. Bender, the nation's top UFO investigator, receives a threatening visit that will bring his research to an abrupt and premature halt.
Albert K. Bender founded the International Flying Saucer Bureau. This was during the big UFO flap of 1952. Flying saucers were witnessed over Washington, D.C. and many other areas around the world. And this organization blew up big within that first year. However, just a year later, he suddenly ended the International Flying Saucer Bureau, and people wondered why. And what happened was that he came home one night, went into his bedroom, and suddenly these three dark, shadowy figures materialized through his wall into his bedroom. They were wearing the hats and the overcoats. They had glowing eyes, and they smelled like sulfur.
According to Bender, the three entities communicated with him through telepathy, warning him to discontinue his UFO research and stop publishing his influential magazine, The Space Review. Afterwards, he became ill and didn't eat for 3 days.
After this experience, Bender was repeatedly visited. He said they gave him headaches, they controlled him telepathically, and he ultimately gave up his UFO researches and stopped publishing the Space Review, in which he documented UFO sightings throughout the world.
He told the people that had been subscribers and he was working with, they told me, we come from a very, very far distant place in this universe. And we have been coming and going from your planet for some time, and we cannot allow you or anyone to interfere. And in fact, we have taken many humans from this planet to cover up our operations until we are done.
This is a very influential point in our history, especially in the ufology community, in which shadow entities interfered and thwarted somebody's research and possibly set the field back a number of years.
The visitors Albert Bender encountered matched descriptions of what is today known as the Hat Man, but he called them by another name, the Men in Black. While the Men in Black are often portrayed in pop culture as government agents, many who claim to have encountered them believe they are something other than human.
The Men in Black are mysterious and nefarious entities. They're shadowy. They wear black clothing. Many people believe that they're either extraterrestrials or somehow they're working for extraterrestrials to prevent humans from learning the truth about extraterrestrials on Earth.
They talk to UFO witnesses. Some people have reported they seem to not know things that are common, like which end of a pin to use, or if they're offered something to eat or drink, they don't know how to eat or drink it.
Both the Hat Man and the Men in Black are known for wearing a hat. They both influence people telepathically. They both appear to be sometimes malevolent, and they could in fact be the same type of a being. There's a theory that the Hat Man and the Men in Black are actually the ringleaders of the shadow people, and that in fact they direct the shadow people to influence humans in particular to keep them from investigating UFO experiences.
There's no question that the stories of shadow people, Men in Black, and other visitations are all mixed in together. Are they the same? Possibly. But what is really happening on this planet is mass hysteria of real events that are happening to real people, and they can't understand what's going on. Who knows what's happening?
Right. Who does? And now that is where the conversation starts becoming extremely interesting to me, because notice the progression in the lore. In the Black-Eyed Kid stories, the entities seem crude, uncanny, emotionally hollow, almost like something wearing a mask that doesn't quite fit. And so in the Men in Black stories, the phenomenon appears more sophisticated. You've got the witnesses often describe beings that know how to dress like humans. They know how to speak like humans. They know how to imitate social behavior, but still fail in odd little strange ways, like not knowing how to eat properly, not understanding normal conversation, using bizarre speech patterns, appearing waxy or artificial, sometimes smelling of sulfur. I suppose that could be somebody just with, gastrointestinal issues, or displaying telepathic influence. Now that's pretty odd. Almost as if something is attempting, again, humanity, but doesn't fully understand it yet. And honestly, the deeper you go into UFO lore, the more you begin seeing the same recurring idea that the phenomenon itself evolves over time, which brings us to one of the more controversial researchers in the UFO field, David Jacobs. Don't know if you've ever heard of him. I hadn't until this week, but I'm glad I researched it because it's very interesting. Again, I'm not presenting this as proven fact. I'm conjecturing here, but it's researched conjecture. I'm not telling you these claims are unquestionably true. I guess I should put the disclaimer, this video is for entertainment purposes only, so I don't get a strike. So what I am saying is that Jacobs represents a fascinating progression within the mythology itself, because unlike many researchers who simply talk about craft sightings, Jacobs became obsessed with something else entirely that fits what I'm talking about here: hybridization. Not invasion from above, but infiltration from within. And I think Whitley Strieber even touches on that in Communion way back from the 80s. And what's particularly interesting is that he originally rejected the idea completely until, according to him, years of investigation slowly pushed him towards the conclusion that whatever these entities are, they may not simply be visiting humanity. They may be attempting to integrate into it. So I think I have this clip here with him set up. Yes, I do. I don't think we'll listen to this entire clip, but I just want you to hear the very first part of it where he's talking about how he thought it was kind of all a bunch of steaming Barbra Streisand. But then at some point, he does the investigation just like I do, digs into things, and it's like, holy cow, oh my gosh, I wish I didn't know that now, sort of a thing. So let's give this a listen and see what he's got to say. Let me pull that up, and here we go. Probably get a ding on this music and not be able to monetize.
I've heard, and theories around the internet have obviously said that these hybrids are looking more and more human-like over the years. Can you tell us what is the reason for this and what is their intention?
People have asked me that question for years, for many, many years. You think they're walking around among us? Are hybrids walking around among us? And I used to love that question because it always made me feel sane when I said, absolutely not. There's no evidence whatsoever that they're walking among us. And I felt good, and I felt like I could actually say no to something. Now, having spent since 2003 investigating this subject of just that point, I can say that my defense has been stripped away. I can't feel sane anymore. I have to I'm all in with this in a sense. And the evidence has now pushed me to the situation, to the position where I think that this is an infiltration program, an integration program into the society. And it started maybe 10 years ago, something that these beings have called the change. Then they've been calling it that for many years. And I think the change has happened, and that there are hybrids who look quite human who are now integrating into the society. In fact, that's what my next book will be on, which I'm still working on. And it's about the processes and the bureaucracy involved with integrating into the society. I used to think, well, we'll just wake up one day and then they'll be here. It's not like that. It's much more complex. And there is a technique that is involved that uses abductees and uses advanced people. And there's a bureaucracy all the way up into the alien world. And that's what my next book will be on.
Okay. So he just basically repeats the same thing for 10 minutes straight. So I'll spare you that. But essentially, he led off right from the get-go. I guess back then they didn't know how to properly lead people on through YouTube videos to force them to listen to the end, I guess. Now we all know algorithms and everything. So you get the point here. There it is, right? It's essentially what I'm saying in this thing. He says 10 years ago, I think it's been going on since before the flood. And we'll get to that. It's just he happened to notice it. He caught data points and evidence and so on. And so that is the culmination of this progression, right? Not monstrous hybrids openly ruling kingdoms like the stories before the flood, and not crude, uncanny manifestations like shadow entities or black-eyed kids any longer. But though that, I think that still happens some, but beings allegedly learning to blend in better, learning human behavior, learning integration, and learning mimicry. Or it could be that the rebellious sons of God are having to relearn it, or possibly having to get around certain restraints. Perhaps the restrainer of lawlessness prevents some of this, but as they gain more permissions, they're able to assimilate better, if that makes sense to you. So now whether Jacob's is correct or not is almost really secondary to the larger pattern emerging across this mythology itself, because from the ancient world until now, humanity has repeatedly preserved stories involving entities that attempt to cross these boundaries between the spiritual and the physical, between heaven and flesh, and between the human race and the non-human. And maybe that's why some of the biblical imagery surrounding the seed war suddenly takes on an entirely different tone when viewed through this particular lens. Like, take the parable of the wheat and the tares. Most of us grew up hearing simplistic Sunday school versions where the wheat simply means good people and the tares mean bad people. But the actual imagery is far more unsettling than that. In the ancient world, tares, particularly darnel wheat, looked nearly identical to real wheat until maturity. So the entire warning hinges on the resemblance or mimicry or false likeness, an enemy planting something among the crop that appears authentic until the time of separation. And now, am I claiming Jesus was explicitly teaching about hybrids? I'm not 100% certain, so I'm not going to go necessarily beyond what scripture seems to say. That's the view I hold, but I'm open to other views, broader terms for what that means. But within, again, the broader biblical theme of corrupted seed, counterfeit kingdoms, and rebellious sons of God in the days of Noah, the imagery suddenly becomes deeply provocative, because perhaps the greatest deception is not obvious evil, but the greatest deception is imitation, counterfeit humanity, counterfeit spirituality, and counterfeit inheritance. Isn't that what the Antichrist really is a counterfeit Christ? And so if all of this sounds bizarre to modern ears, maybe it's because humanity has forgotten that the oldest stories on earth already described a world once corrupted by beings that crossed boundaries between heaven and flesh, giants, hybrid bloodlines, corrupted kingdoms, the days of Noah. And maybe the modern phenomenon is not something entirely new, but the continuation of a rebellion that's never really ended. And that brings us directly into our next segment, the ancient world itself, and whether humanity has already seen this pattern before. So now, what if we discussed, in the first segment, I know it sounds bizarre to modern ears, but maybe it's because modern humanity has just forgotten that the ancient world was filled with stories of beings crossing boundaries between heaven and flesh, right? And so what's fascinating is that these stories are not isolated to the Bible alone, right? They appear everywhere in Mesopotamia, in Greece, Egypt, the Americas, the ancient Near East, Sumer, Babylon, Canaan, it's one of the points we made last Monday. And again, the ancient world preserves traditions of hybrid beings and giant rulers and divine offspring and corrupted kingdoms that existed before catastrophic judgments reset civilization. And so tonight, I'm not arguing that every mythological account is perfectly accurate history, right? Clearly, mythology became distorted over time to some degree, but what is deeply interesting is that cultures separated by geography and language and time repeatedly preserved the same central motif. The gods came down, they mixed with humanity, hybrid offspring of various types emerged, giants on down to men with incredible abilities, not necessarily giants. Knowledge was given, civilization advanced rapidly, corruption spread, judgment followed. And that pattern repeats again and again and again and again. And for the Christian worldview, the foundation of this entire discussion begins in one of the most controversial passages in all of Scripture, of course, Genesis 6:1-4, where it says, "When man began to multiply on the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. And the Lord said, well, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. I'm looking into that verse because I think it's weird. and it's been interpreted in many different ways. And then it continues. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, any time the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And so for years, and to this day, churches have attempted to explain this away as merely the godly line of Seth marrying the ungodly line of Cain. But the problem with that interpretation of the phrase sons of God, B'nai Elohim in Hebrew, is used elsewhere in the Old Testament for nothing but divine beings. In Job chapter 1 and Job chapter 2 and Job chapter 38, and also in various other ones. If you're familiar with Michael Heiser and his work became so important in modern scholarship regarding the divine council worldview, because Heiser argued that the ancient Hebrews would have naturally understood Genesis 6 as rebellious heavenly beings crossing boundaries into the human realm, not sons of Seth. Now, whether every detail of extra biblical tradition is correct or not, we know the early Jewish world overwhelmingly interpreted Genesis 6 this way. I don't really know of any other interpretation according to the Jewish world, which brings us to books like the Book of Enoch. And I know it's not scripture, I get that, but it's important as a historical document because it preserves how many ancient Jews understood Genesis 6 during the Second Temple period, right? In fact, if you listen to this quote from Enoch, it says, "And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood." So now, whether portions of Enoch became embellished over time isn't really the point, is it? The point is that ancient people, even outside of Enoch and in their own culture's writing, believed that the world before the flood had become biologically corrupted. Now, they may not have seen it as corrupted. I do, and so does Scripture. Many of them, in some of these polytheistic cultures, worshipped these beings. So it's not merely morally corrupted here, it's biologically corrupted. And then suddenly the flood narrative takes on an entirely different tone, right? God wasn't being just a big old meanie. Perhaps the flood was not just simply punishment just for generic wickedness or great wickedness, although it was that. Maybe, well, not maybe to me, but have you ever thought it was containment, a reset, a preservation of humanity itself? Because what may have existed back then may not have been fully human any longer, except for one family. And what's interesting is that Genesis says something many people overlook. The Nephilim were on earth in those days and also afterward. Meaning the problem did not disappear after the flood. And so you get beyond the flood narrative, the Bible continues describing giant clans repeatedly. The Anakim, the Rephaim, the Zamzummim, the Emim, and then you have King Og of Bashan, who's described as having a bed that's almost 14 feet long. And then you have the Israeli spies returning from Canaan saying, "Hey, there we saw the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we did to them." And so you got 2 points of view there. It's not just that they, felt insignificant next to mightier people or, some weird way of dismissing it. Both sides saw them as itty bitty compared to their height. And then again, I know critics will say, well, that's mythology, but the point is this: why does virtually every ancient civilization preserve some version of giants or hybrid traditions? Every one of them. There's not one that doesn't. And so the Greeks had the titans and demigods, right? Mesopotamia had the Apkallu. The Egyptians had divine bloodline kings. The Romans preserved stories of semi-divine rulers. Even into almost modern-day Japan, they thought that their emperors were gods. And then cultures all over the earth preserve stories of the old ones, beings that were larger, stronger, wiser, and often, if not completely, tyrannical and engaged in horrible behavior. And maybe these stories are distorted echoes of something humanity once collectively remembered, right? Really bizarre stuff. And that brings us to another question. What if the ancient world was not primitive at all? Because I don't believe it was. What if portions of the antediluvian world were extraordinarily advanced? I mean, you hear it in the writings, right? Flying on craft, these silver discs, that the people from India describe, I don't think they were just merely technologically advanced, but advanced because the rulers themselves were not entirely human. I know that might sound extreme to some people, but think about what Genesis 6 worldview implies. It implies forbidden knowledge, boundary crossing, corrupted kingdoms, watcher influence, hybrid rulers, and more than likely hybrid humans or humans who have been changed, just as we're changing today. And then suddenly stories about ancient megalithic structures, impossible engineering feats, layout patterns around temples that look an awful lot like a motherboard, and mysterious civilizations begin taking on a very different tone. Now, that does not mean every conspiracy theory online is true. I know, and you got to be careful and do your due diligence, but it does mean the ancient world may have been far stranger than modern secular history allows. In fact, we know this. I mean, you can see a million different videos on YouTube all about it. And maybe the ancients were not primitive humans who magically built impossible structures. Maybe portions of the ancient world were ruled by beings that were not entirely human. Excuse me. Got a tickle on my chest. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because this mirrors exactly what we discussed in segment 1. Entities attempting embodiment, integration, and rulership among humanity. And one area people often go to too far maybe is the subject of elongated skulls. Many elongated skulls throughout history were absolutely the result of intentional cranial deformation. That is actually historically documented. But to me, what's always been interesting is why would cultures across the world repeatedly practice this? Why imitate that appearance? Why did elongated headed elites become associated with rulership, priesthood, and divine ancestry in so many ancient societies, causing regular humans to board their children's heads to imitate it? And then you have, the claims that they're really no longer claims. You can literally see these things exhibited where you have unusual cranial volume. You can't board somebody's head and create increased cranial volume or structural differences beyond simple deformation. And obviously not every video you see is legitimate, but it's pretty clear now that these elongated skull things were a thing, including the beings that we have discovered that have 3 digits instead of normal 5 and look very strange. Again, mimicry, counterfeit inheritance, the old rebellion repeating itself in different forms. That's what we have. And then you have an even more unsettling story, because if Genesis 6 is describing some sort of genuine corruption of humanity itself, then suddenly you have this detail in the biblical texts that most Christians just skip right over or become indifferent to, but they're incredibly important. Like, take Noah. Most modern sermons tell us that Noah was spared because he was morally righteous. And of course, he was certainly obedient to God, but the text may be saying something even deeper than that, right? Where it talks about his generations and that Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations. And that phrase, perfect in his generations, it's debated, and has been for centuries, because the wording can imply his lineage, descent, or pedigree. And we know from past videos we've done that it's also associated with spotless lamb sacrifices. And I think Noah's genealogy is critically important, because I think the world before the flood had truly become corrupted through hybridization and boundary crossing between heavenly beings and humanity, to the point where all but that one family was tainted in some way, either genetically or spiritually in their head, possibly through technology, a hive mind, kind of like their own version of 5G, 8G, whatever's coming down the pike. Because I don't think it was just merely moral corruption that took place. I think that was a big part of it. Like where it says, and God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That is not normal. Not normal at all. So humans are fallen, yes, and sinful, but only evil continually. That describes something way deeper and something corrupt to its core. Maybe even no longer human. Probably because permission was given due to the fact that these people were worshiping these lesser G-gods, the rebellious Elohim. And so the flood became containment, a rescue mission for humanity itself, and so did Babel. Because by the time of Noah, truly human beings made in the image of God had become exceedingly rare. 8. And if that sounds extreme, remember what we discussed earlier, the tares in the wheat. Right? And In some cases, the terrifying thing about the tares is not that they look obviously monstrous, it's that they resemble the wheat almost perfectly until the harvest. And that imagery becomes profoundly important when viewed through the seed word lens, because maybe the days of Noah, the wheat had nearly disappeared from the field entirely. I mean, 8 folks in the entire world remained. I don't think we think about that enough and take it into consideration. Noah and his family. The rest of the world, though appearing human outward, may no longer have been fully what God originally created mankind to be. Clearly, I mean, just the thought life. And again, I'm not claiming scripture explicitly spells out every detail of this, but the themes become difficult to ignore once you start connecting the dots of corrupted seed, counterfeit humanity, hybrid bloodlines, preserved lineage, and repeated divine intervention whenever humanity approaches complete corruption. And after the flood, the pattern begins again, Babel. And most people think of Babel simply as humanity trying to build a really tall tower into the heavens. But the story is way darker than that. You got figures associated with Babel, right? Nimrod. He's described in Genesis as becoming something unusual, right? Genesis 10 says he began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that phrase, mighty one, is the Hebrew word Gilbert. And that same root connected to the mighty men, the powerful ones, the ancient warriors tied to the Genesis 6 traditions. So in other words, Nimrod is not merely presented as a political ruler. He is presented as someone becoming something. And suddenly that whole Babel story starts looking less like just human pride and more like reemergence of the same old rebellion of the pre-flood world after the flood. And then they move into one language, one government, one unified system, one rebellion against divine boundaries. And once again, humanity was attempting to become something other than what God created it to be. He clearly told them to disperse and fill the earth, and they gather in one place, the exact opposite, which would explain why judgment comes again, right? Confusion, division, scattering, containment. And what's fascinating is that humanity repeatedly preserves stories of resets after periods of corruption and civilizational collapse, right? We got flood traditions, lost civilizations, sudden depopulation, forgotten ages, orphan populations appearing after catastrophic societal shift. And, I know there's a great deal of speculation about mud floods and Tartaria and orphan trains and resets in history, but there are genuinely strange historical questions that deserve examination. For example, in the 1800s and early 1900s, you had hundreds of thousands of orphan children relocated all throughout America alone, just in America. And primarily, some 250,000 just out of New York. And you had entire institutions that existed to process and redistribute these populations. Massive buildings and infrastructure just appear in regions and with surprisingly very sparse populations. How were they built? We don't build structures like that today. And some researchers have asked whether humanity periodically experiences hidden resets following times of catastrophic upheaval. And I'm not claiming this proves hybrid civilizations existed in the 1800s. Not at all, but I'm saying it's pretty weird. And it seems like humanity preserves memories of judgment and collapse and separation and restarting, as though history just moves in these cycles of corruption and containment and restoration as they infiltrate. And I think it's because the pattern exists because the wars never ended. We've got this struggle between the wheat and the tares, between the image of God and counterfeit inheritance, between humanity and those seeking to corrupt humanity. And this has continued from the days before the flood until now. And maybe that explains why modern disclosure narratives sound so strangely familiar to the old stories on Earth. Some of the oldest, maybe just slightly differently worded. And so one of the more unsettling parables that we've brought up a couple times is that Jesus, that I think Jesus ever gave, I think carries more weight than ever, right? Again, it's not merely just good versus evil or believers versus unbelievers, but some mixture, counterfeit likeness, an enemy sowing among the field, right? So in Matthew 13, Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept," or gave permission, right? "His enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way," the enemy. "But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the housekeeper came and said unto him, Sir, didst thou not sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath it tares? And he said unto them, An enemy hath done this." And the servant said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he says, Nay, lest while you gather up the tares, you root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. Wow. So strange imagery. The tares grow among the wheat, and they resemble the wheat. And the separation is delayed until the appointed time, and the field itself becomes contested territory, probably because of the laws of heaven and rules of engagement. It seems like the obedient angels, at least in my interpretation, the obedient angels just wanted to go in there and kick some butt and uproot these things, these sneaky little things, And so later, when Jesus explains the parable privately to his disciples, he says something really important. He says, He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that soweth them is the devil. Children of the kingdom, children of the wicked one. Competing seeds, competing inheritances, competing kingdoms. And suddenly the entire biblical narrative begins to take on a much larger scope you may not have thought of before. Because maybe the conflict throughout Scripture has never merely been about human governments, but something behind the kingdoms and the empires, behind the bloodlines, behind the systems of the ancient world. There were these other powers, watcher powers, territorial powers, rebellious spiritual authorities seeking dominion over the earth itself by leaving their first estate and trying to emulate for their own offspring those who have the birthright. And it might be why the ancient world repeatedly built cities and mountains and temples and gates and kingdoms associated with these beings. And that brings us to an interesting Derek Gilbert study here, because I want to caution everyone listening tonight that some of what we're discussing is speculative, of course. We are dealing with ancient languages, ancient cosmologies, Second Temple Jewish ideas, and the supernatural worldview of the ancient Near East. So I'm not asking anyone to blindly accept every conclusion, but I am asking you to notice certain patterns, because what we've covered so far tonight forms this progression, right? Segment 1 explores the idea that the phenomenon is walking among us right now. Entities attempting imitation, infiltration, mimicry, and integration. And then in segment 2, we explored whether the ancient world itself had become corrupted before the flood, which clearly it had, not just merely morally, but biologically and spiritually through hybridization and the rebellion of the Watchers. It seems like they tampered with everything. Maybe they made plant life larger to be able to feed their giant offspring, and same with animals. They corrupted everything. Now, in segment 3, we're going to reveal the real scope of the rebellion, because perhaps the Watchers did not merely corrupt individuals, but entire systems, cities, kingdoms, territories, and civilizations. And that might be why Scripture reveals or repeatedly shows God intervening not merely against wicked people and individuals, but against entire structures of rebellion, right? We had the flood in Babylon and Sodom and the giant clans of Canaan, Bashan, and the Rephaim kingdoms. And again, biblical story appears to involve the destruction of corrupted territories connected to rebellious powers. And that is where the work of Derek Gilbert and Michael Heiser become incredibly important, because they begin asking a question that most Christians never even consider. What if the rebellion described in Scripture was geographic as much as it is spiritual? And what if the earth itself had become divided among rebellious powers and their offspring? And what if certain passages in Isaiah and Numbers preserve traces of that worldview? For instance, Isaiah 14. Most Christians know Isaiah 14 primarily as a judgment passage against the king of Babylon, and symbolically against Lucifer, Hillel ben Shakar, the shining one who sought to exalt himself above God, right? We all know this. We've probably heard it in church. Derek Gilbert points out something extremely strange buried in the text. So here's the original text. It says, May the offspring of evildoers nevermore be named. Prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with cities. That is Isaiah 14:20 through 21. Now, on the surface, that all sounds pretty normal. Sounds like a judgment against some evil entity, perhaps, or a bad ruler. Gilbert and Heiser both point out that the Hebrew word translated cities is Ir. And in Aramaic, same word, I think I'm pronouncing that right, I don't know. The exact same word means watcher. So now this becomes fascinating, because Michael Heiser had already shown how certain Aramaic words appear to have crossed into Hebrew Scripture before, most famously with the word Nephilim. So meaning that Isaiah's phrase may potentially carry a double meaning, not merely filled the world with cities, possibly filled the face of the world with watchers and their offspring. And suddenly, it changes everything dramatically. So instead of simply describing urban expansion, Isaiah may be warning about the offspring of rebellious powers spreading across the earth, possessing the world, multiplying, expanding their dominion, filling the earth with counterfeit rulers and counterfeit seed. Oh, those jokers in the late 1800s, right? That pretty much took over the world through intrigue, influence, money, power, bloodlines. And when viewed through the Genesis 6 worldview, the interpretation becomes incredibly provocative, because what was original rebellion, if not an attempt to corrupt humanity itself? Seriously. And perhaps that's why Isaiah says, prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers. The sons, the offspring, the continuation of the rebellion. And maybe that's why God repeatedly intervenes through biblical history whenever corruption spreads too far, including in the 1800s. And this brings us directly back to the parable of the wheat and the tares, because what are tares? Counterfeit seed planted by an enemy into the field. What's the field? Where we're standing, folks. Growing beside the wheat, looking similar to the wheat, expanding among the wheat until the harvest. And maybe this is why the language in Isaiah becomes so creepy, because if these rebellious powers sought to fill the face of the world with watchers, or watcher cities, or whatever, then the tares are not merely isolated bad individuals, they represent expansionary seed, a rival inheritance, just like Islamism tries to do the same thing, spread, outbreeding, you get it, right? It's an attempt to overtake the field itself like weeds. And maybe this is precisely why the flood narrative becomes so important, because by Noah's day, maybe the wheat had nearly vanished entirely from the field. Again, only 8 remained. And so the preservation of the image of God with humanity itself would have gone away. And so the flood, again, looks less arbitrary, like arbitrary wrath, and more like containment, preservation, rescuing the world. And so it gets even weirder when you get to Numbers 24. And this is Balaam speaking prophetically about the coming ruler from Israel. Listen carefully. Quote, a star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. And one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities. So now in English, cities sounds harmless. This is Numbers 24, 17 and 19. But again, Derek Gilbert argues that if Isaiah reading is correct, then this passage may carry the same double meaning. Not merely destroying cities, but destroying the surviving watchers and their offspring. And so you think about what that implies. The Messiah figure rising from Jacob is not merely overthrowing political kingdoms. He is confronting the surviving powers of the ancient rebellion itself, the tares. And suddenly the entire biblical narrative begins taking on a much larger and weirder cosmic scope. Because maybe the conflict throughout Scripture has always involved competing dominions over the earth, right? God's kingdom versus counterfeit kingdoms, the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent, the wheat versus the tares. And then you have Isaiah 33. Again, Derek also points to Isaiah 33 where the language becomes increasingly strange. Listen carefully to this passage. Quote, behold, their heroes cry in the streets, the envoys of peace weep bitterly. The highways lie waste. The traveler ceases. Covenants are broken. Cities are despised. There is no regard for man. The land mourns and languishes. Lebanon is confounded and withers away. Sharon is like a desert, not Derek's Sharon. And Bashan and Carmel shake off their leaves. Now, Derek notes several fascinating details here. First, the word translated heroes is Ariel, elsewhere associated with Lion of God. And later Jewish traditions associated Israelites with angelic beings. So then Isaiah pairs these heroes with envoys, messengers, malachim. And that's a term often associated with spiritual beings. And suddenly the passage begins sounding less like ordinary political collapse and more like supernatural upheaval. Then comes the phrase, the traveler ceases. Traveler. Well, Derek specifically hints that this term becomes extremely important later in understanding the movements and operations of these rebellious entities throughout the ancient world, and even today, in my opinion, and then becomes perhaps the most chilling line of all. There is no regard for man. No regard for man. And maybe that is the heart of the rebellion and why we see such inhumane cruelty. Maybe because The people committing these acts of inhumanity to, the kids coming across the border and all these other things is because they're not human, or they're in alliance with these other things that are not human. So if these powers seek to fill the world with their offspring and their systems, their kingdoms, and their image, then mankind itself becomes the obstacle, and the true image bearers become the enemy. And that would explain why Scripture repeatedly associates certain territories with giant clans, underworld imagery, and rebellious powers like Bashan, Mount Hermon, Canaan, the Rephaim territories. They're not merely pagan nations, but geographical strongholds tied to the old rebellion, pretty much ongoing. So Mount Hermon, according to ancient Jewish tradition, was where the Watchers descended in the days of Jared and bound themselves by oath before corrupting humanity, right? Their oath, where we go one, we go all. Just kidding, but it's pretty similar. Just saying. So Bashan later becomes associated with King Og, the Rephaim, bull symbolism, underworld imagery, and the gates of hell. And suddenly the ancient world starts looking less like disconnected mythology and more like territories under competing spiritual dominions, counterfeit kingdoms mirroring the kingdom structure of God himself, because that's where they come from. They came from a structure under God that involved a kingdom, and now they're just making their own in their own image apart from God, and persuading us to do likewise, or at least align ourselves with them. So if ancient rebellion organized itself through systems, kingdoms, bloodlines, cities, and centralized power, then what does the modern world look like, right? We have global governance, right? Technocracy, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, digital identity systems, transhumanism, smart cities, all involving things like centralization, integration, modification of humanity from its original intent, and counterfeit transcendence, a new Babel, or maybe the rebuilding of the cities of the Watchers again. So now I'm not claiming every modern city is literally ruled by fallen angels, but who knows, right? But I am saying humanity repeatedly appears drawn toward the exact same rebellion again and again. Maybe it's because the beings behind it are still attempting to do the same thing over and over. The desire to transcend God-given limits, alter humanity itself, create counterfeit immortality, and to establish systems independent from the Creator, right? They want do as thou wilt without any sort of restraint. And they couch it in terms like liberty and freedom, and that sounds good. But if there's no moral restraint or responsibility combined with it, then it's just Aleister Crowley packaged with roses. It's the same rebellion, wearing modern clothing. And maybe it's why Scripture repeatedly warns that the end times will be defined not merely by wickedness, but by lies and deception, things that sound good but aren't. It's hybridized, counterfeit, transhuman. The culmination of the ancient rebellion returning one final time for its last breath. And it brings us directly to the final section tonight, because if these powers truly do seek to possess the earth and fill the world with their offspring, with cities and establish counterfeit dominion, then one question becomes unavoidable. Why do they need humanity at all? Why hybridize? Why infiltrate? Why imitate? And why seek embodiment, unless something about humanity grants us legal authority over this world? And perhaps that is the battle over the birthright. So as we move into this final section, I want to make something very clear. What we're discussing here is ultimately theological and speculative synthesis. We are connecting biblical themes, ancient traditions, UFO lore, seed war theology, and the work of researchers who see recurring patterns stretching from Genesis until now. But if there is one central idea that seems to unify all of these threads, it is this. The battle's always been about some sort of inheritance. Who inherits the earth? Who possesses lawful dominion over it? Who bears the image of God? I always used to wonder why villains would want to even take over the world. It never really made sense. I mean, who cares? Who wants to run? Why not just go live in a cabin somewhere and be at peace? Smoke a pipe with Gandalf on the porch. Maybe Bilbo. Anyway, this is why the rebellion consistently revolves around hybridization, counterfeit seeds, tares, integration, genetic corruption, and imitation, because the rebellious powers cannot legally possess the earth apart from mankind itself, as Tim Alberino points out. So if that's true, the entire history of the seed war makes terrifying sense, right? In Tim Alberino's work, his book Birthright, he repeatedly argues that humanity possesses something unique in creation, this legal inheritance tied to the earth itself. Adam was given dominion. The earth was entrusted to mankind, not angels, not the Watchers, not the rebellious sons of God, mankind. And perhaps this explains why the rebellion repeatedly seeks access through humanity and your permission rather than simple conquest, because they could wipe us out. If dominion over the earth was covenantly entrusted to mankind, then maybe the only way to seize that inheritance legally is through some mixture, counterfeit humanity or a counterfeit seed, the tares among the wheat. And maybe they have this legal right to do so because of our permission we granted. And then suddenly Genesis 6 takes on an entirely different tone. The sons of God do not simply attack humanity from outside. They mingle with humanity and they alter humanity and they corrupt the seed itself. And that is why Noah becomes so important. Not merely because he was morally righteous, which is important, but because he remained uncorrupted and had his lineage recorded to prove it and preserved. And a true image bearer in a world increasingly overtaken by counterfeit inheritance beings. So, in part of this, an interview with Tim and L.A. Marzulli, I wanted to quote something here. Listen carefully to what L.A. Marzulli says regarding the days before the flood. Quote, "Only 8 people get on that ark. Everybody else drowns in the flood. Did the enemy have something that people took into themselves and no longer made them human? They were no longer human." I agree with him. Now, whether every aspect of that interpretation is correct or not, you think about the implications. If the world before the flood had become biologically corrupted, tongue doesn't want to work, then the flood may not merely represent judgment against wicked behavior. It may represent preservation, like I've been saying, of humanity itself, our genetic code. Attainment, again, rescue of the image of God within mankind. And maybe that is why biblical narrative repeatedly focuses on genealogy, the boring parts you don't like to read, lineage and seed, because a war is not merely spiritual. It talks about lineage and seed and DNA. It is genetic, covenantal, and inheritance-based. And so that brings us to one of the strangest prophetic passages in Scripture. In Daniel 2:43, it says, "They shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another." And for centuries, commentators have debated the verse, well, who are they? Why distinguish they from the seed of men? Why the language of mingling? And within the framework we've been exploring tonight, the passage becomes incredibly provocative, right? Because that sounds exactly like what we've been saying. Integration, mixture, counterfeit humanity, and attempted inheritance through hybridization. And maybe that's why Marzulli immediately connects this verse to the modern abduction phenomenon. He says, quote, "Sperm is taken from the men, ovum is taken from the women, their seed will mingle with the seed of men," unquote. So again, I'm not presenting that as established fact, but I am saying the thematic parallels are really hard to ignore once you place them beside all these other biblical verses. Nephilim traditions, the wheat and the tares, the water rebellion, modern integration narratives, Genesis 6. And then again, to return to David Jacobs, his book, They Walk Among Us. He became so disturbed by the testimonies he collected because according to abductee accounts, the entities repeatedly communicated the same message in basically the same way. Soon we're all going to be together. You won't be able to tell the difference between us, unquote. Now, angels are already capable of doing this, even rebellious ones, I think. But their offspring? Maybe not so much. So think about that in the light of the wheat and tares. Not obvious monsters, not giant warriors openly ruling kingdoms, but near perfect imitation, tares, counterfeit likeness, integration into the field itself like weeds. And it's why the parable becomes so unsettling, because the terrifying thing about tares is not that they are visibly monstrous. Again, it's that they look just like you. Maybe not in every way, but close enough to where you can't tell the difference until it's time to harvest. And the goal of the rebellion has always been to make the tares outnumber the wheat, and not merely through violence, but through mixture, alteration, assimilation, and your permission. And so it also explains the apparent hostility, right, that these entities display towards humanity in countless traditions. Again and again, researchers describe the phenomenon as emotionally cold, detached, clinical, and predatory. Not compassionate, not brotherly love or kin, but other. And there's another quote from Marzulli in that interview that makes an extremely important statement. He says, quote, "These entities are malevolent. They are not benevolent. They do not have mankind's best interest at heart," unquote. And he also says right along there, well, not him, but the Isaiah quote. It reminds me of that phrase where he says, there is no regard for man. It's chilling, right? No regard for man. And maybe that's because mankind itself represents an obstacle to them. We are the lawful heirs, the true image bearers of God. And if these rebellious powers seek the birthright to the earth, then humanity itself becomes a target and a gateway, which may explain why the rebellion repeatedly revolves around sexual corruption, genetic corruption, ritual corruption, right? And counterfeit transformation. Not just getting rid of us, offing us, making us feed a tree, but changing us. And again, because we let them, because we like what they have to offer, right? We want to be upgraded. And they tell us it's great, right? It's the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And so that's why the modern world suddenly feels very eerily similar to all the ancient rebellion, transhumanism, genetic editing, the artificial intelligence integration that Elon talks about, brain machine interfacing, synthetic biology, digital immortality. I mean, I love the movie Alita Battle Angel too, but I don't want to be that way, you know? All this human enhancement. And for those who don't know the movie, go watch it. It's awesome. And so again, transcendence through alteration, the promise of becoming more than human. You know, like Rob Zombie says, more human than human. But maybe the real danger is becoming really less human, because if the image of God within humanity is tied to inheritance, then maybe altering humanity itself becomes the final battlefield, you know? Maybe this is why Jesus warned, as it was in the days of Noah, so it shall be also in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. Not just wickedness, but corruption, boundary crossing, counterfeit seed, and the tares overwhelming the wheat. And so, you know, maybe the greatest deception in history will not come through open invasion from the sky, although I think something like that will happen, but through imitation and integration, right? Through promises of evolving spiritually and physically. Enlightenment, unity, and transcendence. All of that is coming your way, folks. You've already been bombarded in every movie in Hollywood with this garbage. So you'll be given a counterfeit Eden and a counterfeit kingdom and a counterfeit inheritance. And I think it's probably been the plan from the very beginning to fill the earth with their seed, their systems, their kingdoms, and their cities until the wheat itself disappears from the field like it did before the flood. The scripture says the harvest is coming, and at the harvest, the separation returns. So, you know, it's really not about are we alone, but who has the right to rule this world, right? Because from Genesis onward, scripture describes an ancient war over dominion, inheritance, in the image of God itself, right? The seed of the woman, the seed of the serpent, the weed and the tares, or the wheat, the corruption before the flood, the watchers, the giant clans, the cities of the rebellion, the counterfeit kingdoms. Again and again, the same themes emerge of mixture and counterfeit inheritance and boundary crossing and the corruption of humanity itself. And maybe that's why modern disclosure narratives are so oddly familiar to, again, the oldest stories on earth, right? Of all these different things. And the promise of becoming more than human, like a god. Maybe the final deception is not preparing humanity for extraterrestrials. Maybe it's preparing humanity to surrender its inheritance without realizing it and to willingly merge with the very powers that once corrupted the earth before the flood. And maybe that is why scripture repeatedly warns that the last days will be marked not merely by violence, but again, 2 warnings in Matthew 24 alone: deception, counterfeits, old rebellions, wearing modern clothing. And again, the harvest is coming, and when it comes, we're going to have this final wheat and tare separation. So let's end it there, folks. You know, that's tonight's journey down the road that goes ever on here at Pilgrims Grey Chronicles. If I didn't say it before, I'm Robert Clark, your host. As always, I encourage you to don't just believe me. Research this all for yourself. Read the scriptures, study the ancient text, look into the work of these researchers. Test everything, because whether you agree with every conclusion tonight or not, which I don't expect you to, I think one thing is becoming very clear: the world is way stranger than we've been told. And also, before you head out tonight, I want to thank those of you, especially Nick. Thank you for buying me a cup of coffee, and I loved your comment. I don't know if you're listening now, but like I said in my comment back to you when you went to buy me a cup of coffee, I thought it was very clever, and maybe you should be one of my writers, write stuff for the show. But anyway, thank you, Nick. I really appreciate you. And anybody else who has done support, like liking, commenting, subscribing, all the things you do. I am so thankful for it. And may your tribe increase. But I also want to mention that a lot of you have heard and know that I stumbled into the company that helps support this podcast, is helping me, because I was already looking for healthy supplements and products for myself. I've talked openly on the show about how difficult it is these days for independent creators to survive. And I'm not going to go constantly begging and doing, CTAs, without constantly having to censor ourselves or chasing sponsors that want to control our message. I don't want to do that. And so I found somebody that I appreciate and I partnered with, and I've already was using their supplements because what originally caught my attention wasn't any sort of, make money BS. It was the fact that they were offering products I was already interested in, and I could consolidate them, get my subscription to them so that I was actually saving money on things I was already buying. Health supplements, greens, reds, protein, energy support that I take. But the membership pricing is totally killing it for me because I save a ton of money doing it this way. I get it all in one company. And over time, I realized something else, that the business model itself was also interesting. And I took time to look into it, not because of any flashy BS promises, but because it seemed built around ordinary people just trying to create a little more breathing room in their life, more freedom, more time with family, time to pursue the things that God actually puts on your heart that you can't do now because you're busy slaving for somebody else making them money. For me personally, one of those things is this show and writing and music. And so the more support this channel gets, the more time I can dedicate to researching and writing, producing documentaries, interviews, and all the things we talk about here on the road together. So if you're curious about what I've mentioned on previous episodes, you can check out the tour link below that I'll put in there and look through everything yourself. And if you still have questions and want to talk to real people instead of just watching a presentation, there's a private Facebook group that I've been including. You can ask questions there. You can share your experiences and learn more about what this actually is without pressure or weird gimmicks. I'll put the link there. But if you go to the Facebook link and you request access because it's a private group, you'll need to mention my name, Robert Clark, and answer a couple of questions so the admins will know that you're not a bot, because there's way too many bots out there. And so again, whether you support the show through that, or you buy me a cup of coffee, or you buy some of our merchandise, which I freely give out to those who come out on the show, and Emily, I'll be trying to send your shirt out tonight, or at least putting in the order. So you know what? Simply sharing these episodes with friends, liking, commenting, and emailing me, all of these things, I truly appreciate all of you walking this road with me. So until next time, keep your lamp lit, keep your eyes open, and remember, the road that goes ever on will lead home eventually. And so Godspeed to all of you, and I hope you all have an awesome work week. See ya.